In the heart of Moscow, under the gray skies that seemed to weigh heavy on the city, a young woman stood outside the tall glass doors of a private clinic. Her name was Alina. She was nervous, clutching her worn leather folder that held her certificates and the fragile weight of her dreams. She had no experience, but her determination burned brighter than her fear. The clinic was owned by a man everyone in the city seemed to know, Dr. Mikhail Orlov. A millionaire, a surgeon, a man whose reputation was as polished as the steel instruments he worked with. To many, he was untouchable, too powerful, too busy, too perfect. But Alina, trembling as she pushed the doors open, never imagined that one glance would change both of their lives. She walked through the corridor, her eyes wide with awe at the marble floors, the soft hum of machines, and the calm authority of the place. When she reached the reception, the assistant looked at her skeptically, as if doubting she belonged there. But before the woman could dismiss her, a voice rang out from the upper balcony of the clinic. "Let her through." Alina turned. And there he was, Mikhail Orlov himself, standing in a dark tailored suit, his sharp gaze fixed on her. His eyes, a piercing blue, held her still, as though she had been caught in a spell. She lowered her eyes, flustered, but he had already begun descending the stairs toward her. "What brings you here?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. I'm looking for work," she stammered, her voice soft, almost breaking. Something about her innocence, the sincerity in her trembling hands, the way she could barely meet his gaze, struck him. He had met countless women in his life, but never one who seemed to carry both fragility and fire in the same breath. Instead of sending her away, as he should have, he asked her to follow him. His office smelled faintly of leather and cedar wood. She sat across from him, her fingers clutching the folder like a shield. He studied her in silence for a moment, then leaned back. "You have no experience in a clinic like this," he said, his tone measured. "I can learn," she whispered. "All I need is a chance." Her words hung in the air like a quiet challenge. For reasons he couldn't explain to himself, he smiled, the kind of rare smile that softened his usually stern face. Over the next days, Alina was given small tasks, helping nurses, carrying files, observing procedures. She was shy, yet eager, and her presence did not go unnoticed. But it wasn't her work that stirred whispers among the staff. It was the way Dr. Orlov's gaze lingered on her, the way his voice softened when he addressed her. One evening, long after the clinic had closed, Alina found herself in the library, organizing medical books. The silence was comforting until she felt the shift in the air. She turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway, his tie loosened, his gaze unreadable. "You work too late," he said quietly. "So do you," she replied, her voice gaining a hint of courage. He stepped closer, the sound of his shoes echoing against the polished floor. Her heart raced, and she could feel the warmth of his presence before he even touched her. His hand brushed against the spine of a book she held, deliberately close, and she looked up at him, her breath caught in her throat. "Alina," he murmured, her name lingering on his lips. She didn't know who moved first, but suddenly the distance between them disappeared. His hand cupped her cheek, gentle yet firm, and her eyes fluttered shut. His lips met hers in a slow, searching kiss, tender at first, then deepening with a hunger that neither could deny. The world outside ceased to exist, the clinic, the city, the rules, none of it mattered. Her fingers found their way to his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. He pulled her closer, his arms circling her waist as though he had always been meant to hold her. She melted into him, surrendering to a warmth that frightened her yet felt like the only truth she had ever known. When they finally broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "You've bewitched me," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, her eyes glistening. "I didn't mean to." But in that moment, both knew there was no turning back. Would you like me to continue their romance into the next day, showing how their secret bond grows stronger inside the walls of the clinic? The next morning, the world looked the same, yet everything had changed. Alina woke in her small rented apartment with her heart still racing, her lips tingling with the memory of his kiss. She touched her mouth as though to reassure herself it had truly happened. The city outside stirred awake with its usual noise, trams screeching, vendors calling, but for her, the sound was distant, muffled, as if her mind refused to let go of the moment when Mikhail's lips had pressed against hers. She arrived at the clinic earlier than usual, almost afraid of what might happen if she were late. Her reflection in the glass doors startled her. She looked brighter somehow, her eyes carrying a spark she hadn't seen before. She smoothed her skirt, took a deep breath, and pushed her way inside. The morning passed in a blur of tasks. She carried patient files, fetched medicines, assisted in small ways. Every time she turned a corner, her chest tightened, expecting to see him. And when she finally did, when he emerged from his office in his white coat, his stride purposeful, her pulse skipped. He glanced at her, just for a second, and the corner of his mouth lifted in a barely there smile. No one else seemed to notice, but for Alina, the look was enough to make her knees feel weak. Hours stretched on, and though they barely exchanged words, she felt his presence everywhere. When she reached for a chart, his hand brushed hers. When she passed by his office door, she felt the weight of his gaze following her. It was subtle, hidden beneath professionalism, but it was there. A current that pulled her closer no matter how hard she tried to focus on her work. By evening, the clinic began to empty, the staff leaving one by one. Alina lingered at her desk, sorting papers far longer than necessary. She told herself it was duty, but the truth was plain, she was waiting. And when the quiet of night settled over the clinic, she heard the soft click of his door opening. "Still here?" His voice came, warm and calm. She turned slowly, trying to compose herself. "I wanted to finish the files." He stepped closer, his presence filling the corridor. The overhead lights softened the hard lines of his face, revealing something almost vulnerable in his eyes. "You work harder than anyone I've met," he said. Then, after a pause, his voice dropped lower. "Or maybe you're staying for another reason." The air between them thickened. She swallowed, her throat dry, but she didn't deny it. Instead, she held his gaze, a quiet bravery sparking inside her. "Maybe," she whispered. He exhaled softly, as though the answer he'd been holding himself back from was finally given to him. Without another word, he reached for her hand. His touch was steady, certain, yet careful, as though he feared breaking something precious. He guided her toward his office, closing the door behind them. The room was dimly lit, the city lights spilling through the tall windows and casting shadows across the walls. He removed his coat and set it aside, his movements deliberate, his eyes never leaving hers. Alina stood by the desk, her heart thundering. She had never been in such close quarters with him, never so exposed. "Do you regret last night?" he asked suddenly, his voice hushed, almost searching. She shook her head, unable to speak at first. "No," she finally managed. "Not for a moment." A quiet relief crossed his features, and he stepped forward. He lifted his hand and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. She leaned into the touch without thinking, her body betraying her heart. He bent slightly, his lips brushing against her temple before trailing down to her cheek. She closed her eyes, her breath catching, and then his mouth found hers again. This kiss was different. Last night had been tentative, testing. This one was deeper, surer, carrying the weight of all the unspoken feelings they hadn't dared to voice. His arms circled around her, drawing her flush against him, and she felt the strength in his embrace, the warmth of his body grounding her. She clutched his shirt, afraid to let go, afraid the moment would vanish like a dream. He lifted her gently, setting her on the edge of the desk. Papers scattered, but neither cared. His lips trailed down to her neck, slow and deliberate, while her hands tangled in his hair. She gasped softly, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine, and he kissed her harder, as if he couldn't get enough. For a long while, the office was filled with nothing but the sound of their breathing, their hearts beating in frantic harmony. He pulled back only to study her face, his thumb brushing her lower lip. "You're dangerous," he murmured, his voice low, almost reverent. "Do you know that?" Alina managed a breathless laugh, her cheeks flushed. "Me? Dangerous?" He smiled, the kind of smile that melted the distance he always carried, the one no one else could cross. "Yes. You walk into my life, and suddenly, nothing feels the same." She touched his cheek, her eyes soft but steady. "Maybe that's not danger. Maybe that's fate." The word lingered between them, heavier than any kiss. He kissed her again, slower this time, as though savoring the sweetness of the moment. His hand stayed at her waist, steady and protective, as if he feared she might slip away. When the city clock outside struck midnight, the sound echoed faintly through the glass. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling. Neither spoke, for words would have broken the fragile magic binding them in that office, in that hour. Yet deep down, both knew this was only the beginning, that every stolen moment would pull them deeper, that every glance across the clinic corridors would burn hotter, that their lives had already entwined in ways they could no longer untangle. And as he kissed her once more, tender and lingering, Alina realized she was no longer afraid. Not of him, not of herself, not of the uncertain road ahead. She had stepped into a world far greater than she imagined, and with every heartbeat pressed against his, she welcomed it. The night outside wrapped Moscow in a hush, but inside the clinic's office, time had bent itself to their rhythm. Alina stayed perched on the desk, her hand still resting against Mikhail's chest as if she feared the spell might shatter if she let go. His breath was warm against her cheek, steadying her while her own heart raced in uneven beats. He had kissed her again, softer this time, slower, as if he wanted to memorize the feel of her lips, to make the moment stretch into eternity. When he finally stepped back, she thought he might release her entirely. But he didn't. His hand remained at her waist, grounding her. His thumb traced gentle circles over the fabric of her blouse, an absent-minded gesture that betrayed his reluctance to let her go. "You should rest," he murmured, his voice hushed but laced with something that trembled between command and confession. Alina searched his face, the sharp lines softened by the dim light, the blue of his eyes turned stormy by shadows. "And you," she whispered. A faint smile tugged at his lips. "Rest is a stranger to me." For a moment, silence fell between them again, heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that hummed with things unsaid, things neither dared to put into words. She could feel it pressing against her chest, that dangerous pull of wanting more, needing more. At last, he helped her down from the desk, his hand steady on hers. She stood before him, suddenly shy, the heat of their closeness still lingering on her skin. He brushed his fingers lightly across her knuckles before finally releasing her. "Go home, Alina," he said quietly, almost reluctantly. "Before I forget myself completely." She nodded, though her legs felt weak as she walked to the door. Just before leaving, she glanced back once. He was still standing by the desk, watching her as if letting her leave was the hardest thing he'd ever done. The following day, the clinic buzzed as usual. Patients came and went, nurses rushed about, phones rang. Yet beneath the professional surface, Alina and Mikhail carried their secret like a fire hidden under ashes. Every time their paths crossed in the corridors, her breath caught. His gaze found hers in moments too brief for anyone else to notice, but long enough to set her chest ablaze. At lunch, she sat with two nurses in the break room, listening half-heartedly to their chatter. Her thoughts wandered back to the way his lips had pressed against hers, the way he had whispered her name as if it was sacred. She forced herself to nod at the right times, to smile when expected, but her heart was not in it. Meanwhile, in his office, Mikhail tried to drown himself in work. Charts, scans, consultations, none of it dulled the image of her in his arms, her lips trembling against his. He told himself it was madness, that he was a man of reason, discipline, control. But then he would remember the sound of her laugh, soft and breathless, and all his defenses crumbled. That evening, as the clinic emptied again, Alina found herself tidying the shelves in the supply room. The light flickered faintly, the quiet broken only by the rustle of papers. She tried to distract herself, but every heartbeat seemed louder in the stillness. Then came the sound of footsteps. Firm, deliberate. She froze, her back to the door, already knowing who it was. "Working late again?" his voice came, rich with unspoken meaning. She turned slowly, her lips parting, but words failed her. He leaned against the doorway, his tie loosened, the weariness of the day etched into his features. Yet his eyes, those eyes, still burned with the same intensity as last night. I just wanted to finish this," she murmured, holding up a stack of files as if they might shield her. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The small room suddenly felt even smaller, the air thick with tension. "You don't have to pretend," he said softly, his voice steady but edged with something darker. Her pulse quickened. "Pretend that you stay because of duty." His gaze locked onto hers, unflinching. We both know why you linger. She swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on the files before she set them down. Her courage wavered, but then she lifted her chin, refusing to run from the truth. And if I said it's because of you? The silence that followed was electric, charged, dangerous. He moved closer, each step slow, deliberate. She didn't retreat. When he reached her, he lifted his hand and cupped her jaw, tilting her face upward. You're going to ruin me, he whispered, his thumb brushing over her lips. Maybe you need to be ruined, she breathed, her words trembling but sincere. Something in him broke then, the restraint snapping like a taut string. His lips found hers again, urgent and unyielding. She melted against him, her hands gripping his shoulders as if to anchor herself. His kiss was fierce, desperate, as though he had held himself back too long. He pressed her gently against the wall, his body shielding hers, his hands cradling her face with surprising tenderness despite the fire in his touch. She kissed him back without hesitation, pouring all the emotions she couldn't speak into that moment. Every brush of his lips, every breath they shared, bound them tighter together. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers, his chest rising and falling rapidly. "This is dangerous," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "I don't care," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper but steady. He closed his eyes, as if her words struck something deep inside him. His hand slid down to entwine with hers, fingers lacing tightly, as if letting go was no longer an option. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside that small supply room, time stood still, and two souls hovered at the edge of something that neither of them could resist. And when he kissed her again, slower this time, lingering as though savoring every second, Alina knew with certainty. Whatever this was, wherever it led, she was already his, and he was already hers. The quiet of the supply room wrapped around them, holding their secret as tightly as they held each other. Alina could feel his breath mixing with hers, the warmth of his body pressed against her, his heartbeat steady and strong beneath the layers of his shirt. She hadn't known she could feel this way, that a single man's presence could shift the air around her, turn the world into something charged and unsteady. His lips moved against hers again, slower, deeper, until the kiss felt less like a rush and more like a promise. When he finally drew back, his eyes searched hers, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with questions, confessions neither dared to voice, the weight of everything that had begun to grow between them. He brushed his thumb along her cheek, tracing the faint flush there, then let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for hours. "You have no idea what you're doing to me," he whispered. Alina's lips curved into the faintest smile. "Maybe I do." The honesty in her voice startled him, and then his lips twitched into something that almost resembled laughter, though it was hushed and breathless. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. "You're braver than you know." Her hands, which had been clutching the fabric of his shirt, loosened. She smoothed the wrinkles she had made, a small, nervous gesture. But her gaze never left his, steady and luminous. "I only know what I feel when you look at me," she said softly. Those words settled between them like fire, burning away the last remnants of distance. He kissed her again, slower, more deliberate, his hands framing her face as if she were something fragile he couldn't bear to lose. She let herself sink into it, her fingers curling around the back of his neck, drawing him closer. The sound of a door closing somewhere down the hall broke the moment. They both froze, breath held, listening. The clinic wasn't as empty as they had thought. Mikhail cursed under his breath, the sharpness of reality cutting through the haze. He straightened slightly, his hand still lingering on her cheek. "We can't stay here," he murmured. Alina nodded, though her chest ached at the thought of pulling away. He smoothed her hair back, his touch lingering, then reluctantly let his hand drop. They left the supply room separately, careful not to draw attention, but the weight of what had just happened clung to them both. That night, in her apartment, Alina lay awake staring at the ceiling. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, his intense gaze, the way his lips had claimed hers, the warmth of his hands. Her heart ached with longing, but it was laced with fear too. She was not naive. She knew how dangerous it was to fall for a man like Mikhail Orlov. He was powerful, admired, untouchable in the eyes of the world. And she? She was a girl with trembling hands and no name, trying to carve out a life in a city that often felt too big for her. Yet when she remembered the way he had held her, the way his voice had softened only for her, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Mikhail, in his own penthouse overlooking the city, poured himself a glass of whiskey he didn't drink. He stood by the window, staring at the glittering lights below, the world he had built for himself. A world of discipline, order, control. And yet all of it felt unsettled, shaken by a single young woman with wide eyes and quiet determination. He had faced boardrooms, negotiations, surgeries that tested his skill and nerve. None of them had undone him the way Alina did. For the first time in years, he questioned himself. He wondered if allowing her into his life, into his heart, would destroy the walls he had so carefully built. And yet, the thought of staying away from her felt unbearable. The next morning, the air between them and the clinic was charged, though no one else seemed to notice. He gave her assignments through the head nurse, avoiding unnecessary contact. But every time she passed his office, she felt his presence like a magnetic pull. Once, their eyes met through the glass wall of his office. The moment was brief, a fraction of a second, but her breath caught as if he had touched her again. By evening, fate, or perhaps something more deliberate, drew them together again. She was in the records room, arranging files, when the door opened. She didn't need to look up to know it was him. She felt it in her skin, in the sudden quickening of her heartbeat. "Are you avoiding me?" he asked quietly, his voice calm but threaded with something sharp. She turned, clutching a file to her chest. "You've barely spoken to me all day." His jaw tightened. He stepped closer, closing the distance between them with deliberate slowness. "If I spoke to you the way I wanted, everyone would know. And I cannot," he broke off, dragging a hand through his hair, frustration flickering across his face. She set the file down, her hands trembling. "And what do you want, Mikhail?" The sound of his name on her lips stilled him. His gaze darkened, as if she had stripped away every layer of his restraint. In 2 strides he was before her, his hand sliding behind her neck, tilting her head back. "This," he said roughly, before his mouth claimed hers. The kiss was fierce, hungry, yet there was tenderness woven through it, a kind of desperation that spoke of how hard he had tried to resist. She clung to him, her body pressed against his, her heart hammering in time with his. His hands roamed her back, pulling her closer still, as if even this closeness wasn't enough. When he finally pulled away, his breathing was ragged. "You undo me, Alina," he whispered, his forehead pressed against hers. "Every time I see you, every time you smile, I lose myself." Her hand slid up to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid thrum of his heartbeat. "Then don't fight it," she murmured. "Don't fight me." He closed his eyes, a sound escaping him that was half a sigh, half a groan. His arms tightened around her, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to matter again. There were no patients, no staff, no rules, only the two of them, tangled in something they could no longer name, much less deny. As the minutes slipped by, their restraint unraveled further. He kissed her again and again, each one deeper, each one more consuming, until she felt as though the room itself had vanished. His hands framed her face, then slid down to her waist, pulling her flush against him. She responded with a tenderness that surprised even herself, her lips brushing his jaw, her breath warm against his skin. The sound of footsteps in the corridor jolted them, and once again, reality intruded. He pulled back, his expression conflicted, his hands lingering on her as though reluctant to release her. "We're playing with fire," he said in a low voice. Alina met his gaze steadily, her voice soft but sure. "Then let it burn." For a long moment he just stared at her, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Longing, fear, desire, maybe all at once. Then, with a final kiss that lingered like a promise, he turned and left the room, leaving her breathless, trembling, but certain of one thing. This was only the beginning, and neither of them would be able to stop what had already begun. The days that followed moved like a storm with no clear direction. The clinic continued its endless rhythm, patients arriving with worries, leaving with hope, the nurses carrying out their duties with practiced ease. Yet beneath that surface, something dangerous and beautiful bloomed in silence. Mikhail and Alina carried their secret like a hidden flame, one glance across the hall, one brush of fingers when a file was passed, one excuse to linger just a little longer. Every stolen moment fed the fire until it no longer seemed possible to hide. Whispers began to stir among the staff. They noticed how the doctor's voice softened only when addressing her, how his stern expression eased when she entered a room. Some shrugged it off as imagination, others gossiped in hushed tones, but none could grasp the truth of what unfolded behind closed doors. For Alina, every day was a war between fear and longing. She had never imagined stepping into a world like this, the world of a man so far above her. Yet she found herself caught in his orbit, unable and unwilling to pull away. When she returned home at night, she touched her lips, remembering the way he kissed her, the way he whispered her name as if it carried weight beyond measure. She told herself it was dangerous, but her heart silenced her reason. Mikhail, for all his power, for all the control he commanded in his life, was no longer a master of himself. He caught his own reflection one evening and hardly recognized the man staring back. The polished millionaire, the disciplined surgeon, the man who never wavered, undone by a single young woman who met his gaze without fear. It unsettled him, but it also freed him. For the first time in years, he felt alive. One night, after the clinic emptied and the last footsteps faded, Alina lingered again in the quiet halls. She found herself in the library, running her fingers across the spines of books, their titles blurred by her thoughts. The door opened behind her, and without needing to turn, she knew. "You always stay too late," Mikhail's voice came, softer now, the voice of a man speaking only to her. She smiled faintly, her hand still resting on the shelf. "Or maybe you always find me." The door clicked shut, and his steps drew closer. He came to stand behind her, his presence wrapping around her like a shadow and a shield. He leaned in, his breath grazing her ear. "Do you know what you've done to me?" Her hand trembled against the books, but her voice held steady. "Tell me." He turned her gently, his hand resting against her waist, guiding her to face him. His eyes searched hers, as if the words he needed were carved in her gaze. "You've dismantled me," he whispered, "piece by piece. Every wall I built, every shield I carried, you've broken them with a single glance. And I don't want them back." Her lips parted, her chest rising sharply. She had longed to hear him say it, but now that he had, the weight of his confession filled her to the core. Her hand rose almost of its own will, resting lightly on his cheek. "Then don't rebuild them," she said. "Let me in. Let me stay." Something in his expression shifted, his usual restraint crumbled into raw, unguarded emotion. He kissed her then, not with urgency, but with reverence. A kiss that spoke of surrender, of inevitability, of the truth they could no longer deny. His hands framed her face, his lips soft and lingering, and she felt her own soul answer his in quiet certainty. But fate, ever watchful, is rarely merciful. The following week brought its trials. A wealthy investor, long eager to partner with Mikhail's clinic, arrived unexpectedly. He was a man of sharp eyes and sharper words, and it did not take him long to notice the quiet thread binding doctor and assistant. He spoke with veiled amusement, making remarks that left Mikhail cold with fury. The risk of scandal hovered like a storm cloud, threatening to shatter everything they had built in secrecy. Alina felt the shift in him. He grew more guarded, more stern, as though trying to protect her by pushing her away. But every time he looked at her, the mask slipped. His gaze softened, his lips tightened, his hand lingered too long when brushing hers. One evening, when the clinic was silent and the city lights flickered through the windows, he found her in the corridor. His expression was tense, his jaw set. "They are watching," he told her. "And if they see too much, it will destroy you. Not me. You." Her heart clenched at his words, but she stood tall, her chin lifting with quiet courage. "Do you think I care what they say? Do you think their whispers matter more than the truth we hold?" He stepped closer, his voice rough. "I care. Because the world can be cruel, Alina. It can twist innocence into scandal, love into shame. And I cannot." His voice broke for a moment, the rarest crack in his armor. "I cannot let them hurt you." She reached up, cupping his face, forcing him to meet her steady gaze. "Then don't let them. Stand with me. If the world wants to watch, let them. Let them see what love looks like." Her words struck him like lightning, shattering the last of his hesitation. He pulled her into his arms, his lips crushing against hers, a kiss that was both desperate and defiant. In that moment, he knew she was not weakness but strength, his anchor, his undoing, his salvation. The days that followed were not easy. Whispers grew louder, questions sharper. But Mikhail no longer hid. He walked beside her, his gaze steady, his hand brushing hers even in public. To the astonishment of many, he introduced her not as an assistant but as the woman who held his heart. The gossip that followed was fierce, cruel at times, but he bore it with calm defiance, shielding her with his presence. Alina, once timid and uncertain, found her own courage rising. She met the world's stares with quiet dignity, her hand in his, her eyes unflinching. Together, they faced the storm, not unscathed, but unbroken. And so, the story that began with a trembling girl at the clinic doors and a man whose life seemed untouchable ended not in secrecy, but in light. Their love, born in stolen moments and whispered confessions, grew strong enough to withstand the world's gaze. It was not perfect, nor easy, but it was real, undeniable, and fierce. One evening, as they stood together on the balcony of his penthouse, the city sprawling beneath them, Mikhail wrapped his arms around her from behind. The wind tugged at her hair, the lights below flickered like 1,000 beating hearts. He pressed a kiss to her temple, his voice low and steady. "Do you ever regret walking into my clinic that day?" Alina turned in his arms, her smile soft, her eyes glowing with certainty. "Not for a moment. Because that was the day I found you." He kissed her then, the kind of kiss that carried every moment they had shared, every battle they had fought, every promise they had yet to fulfill. And as the city moved restlessly below, they stood still in their own world, bound not by fear or secrecy, but by the love that had conquered them both. Their story was not one of perfection, but of passion, courage, and defiance. A love that began with a glance, grew with a kiss, and survived the storm of whispers to stand proud and unshaken. For those who witnessed it, their story was unforgettable. And for them, it was eternal, an ending that was not an end at all, but the beginning of everything.